let's begin our class, and with it the 20th century, and the study of the 20th century, which calls itself the modern era. Or it's not, but I think we've already seen that it's not the first that calls itself the modern era. And one of the challenges for students, I know, is in terminology and the confusion of terminology. Because it can be used historically, it can be used in reference to art, it can be used in reference to philosophy. The word modern refers to the mode or the fashion. So if that's the case, then modern, everything modern is always modern. Everything new is fashionable. And so it's a moving target. What is modern is going to change as the times change. But we still associate the 20th century, at least in a literary way, with modernity. Modern literature really is sort of the 20th century poets, T.S. Eliot and so forth. We're not going to look at Eliot right now, but we are going to look at Conrad's little novella, Heart of Darkness. Now, it's a novella in the same sense that we just saw Dostoevsky's Death of Ivan Ilyich is, but it's a little bit later, and this is a British novel. But it has some interesting features to it, and one of the interesting features is that it was written by a non-English speaker in English, however. So the author, Joseph Conrad, was actually Polish and immigrated to Britain and spent much of his life, at least some of his life, as a seaman. So he was doing somewhat of what his hero Marlowe does. He was a sailor, traveling around the world on merchant vessels and so forth. I'm not sure where it is in that, because I don't have that book. I can't find that book right now, but it's well on into it. 1621 is mine, but yours, I don't know exactly. So there's something self-consciously new and modern in it, yes?
So Joseph Conrad, you said?
Yes.
Heart of Darkness?
Yes.
That's 1691.
1691. So it's new in the sense that we've seen repeatedly this repeated gesture towards newness, which began all the way back in the Renaissance, actually. So the Renaissance was a rebirth, a renaissance, a rebirth of classical culture. And the Enlightenment was marked by this a conflict between the ancients and the moderns. That was one of the flashpoints of the Enlightenment. So this term modern has been used repeatedly in different ways in different ages, and we will categorize Conrad's Heart of Darkness under that same idea of modernity. And he will express something of the order of existentialism, which is not which is associated with philosophy, and it doesn't really become popular until the 1940s and 1950s. In other words, in the context of the Second World War, although you can see the predecessors for existentialism in writers back in the 19th century. Still, there are aspects of this work of Heart of Darkness that have features of that existentialist movement, and one of the reasons that they arise is simply because of the experience of empire, which we saw when we looked at Tennyson, and the consequences of that, and the moral consequences of it, and some of the challenges that arise out of it. This text is also seen as being written, it's a colonialist text. So that probably is fairly clear, but colonialism, a reference to the colonization of the world by the European powers, largely. So the British, the Germans, the Dutch, the French, the Italians, the Spanish, the Portuguese, all have colonies all around the globe at this point. So it's an age of expansion and empire, and the world, I remember growing up in and seeing maps of the period, that they'd be color coded. So British imperial rather countries had a pink color. So Canada was in pink, and so was Australia and New Zealand, and at one point a little earlier on, India, even China would have been colored pink. So that at one point 1/3 of the globe would have had a British color. And the reason I say that is in the novella he talks about maps and the mapping of the world, and with that, and I don't know if you've ever really thought about this, but when you map something, you are comprehending it in some ways. You're making it an object of knowledge and claiming it's something that you it's being brought under the guise of science to some degree, and progress for that matter. So to be able to know where something is, where this river lies, what exact latitude and longitude, what the terrain is like, those go with a map. And then with the map, at the bottom corner, I think it's the bottom corner, usually there's this thing called a legend, which if we think back to Conrad, or to Tennyson, the legend is there to explain what you see pictorially represented on the map. But you must read the legend. And the legend is literally, from the Latin, it means to be read. And the reason it's to be read is because if you don't read the legend, then you don't know what the little pictorial representations mean, and you certainly don't know, among other things, the scale. So if each centimeter represents 10,000 kilometers, that's very different than if it represents 1 kilometer, for instance. So it is going to make a difference. So you must read the legend in order to understand the map. All of that, though, is bringing the whole of the world under the knowledge and to some degree dominion of the European powers. And that creates, obviously, there's an age of progress, a sense of progress and expansion, at the same time that it doesn't happen without problems. And Conrad explores some of the problems that arise out of it. So there's an extension of power and empire, and at the same time, there is a moral ambiguity about that extension of power. And when I say ambiguity, he's pretty unambiguous that he thinks it's problematic. So it's a colonialist text in the sense that it arises out of the colonialist period, but I think it's also a post-colonialist text insofar as it's criticizing colonialism. And I don't think that there's any way of not seeing that. It is a critique of colonialism. Having said that, there is an author, Nigerian author by the name of Chinua Achebe. You know him? Or have you heard of him? Nobel Prize winning. Wrote a novel himself called Things Fall Apart, and he claimed that Heart of Darkness was, in its depiction of the Africans, was derogatory. It presented them as lazy and unintelligent and so forth. So he regarded the portrait as expressing the colonialist view of the Africans, and so he pushes back against the portrait. I've never really understood the perspective per se, insofar as it seems to me that Conrad is he's expressing the European view, but he's also showing us why we ought to regard the view as problematic, and I think that's unambiguous in the text. So he's doing both. He looks at it like a European, and at the same time he's showing how lacking in moral clarity the European view is. So it's a critique of colonialism. And but anyway, Achebe writes a novel in response to that, and accuses it of colonialism. Things Fall Apart, which is a line from a W.B. Yeats poem that we will read shortly. But this text has been, so some see it as the beginning or a representation of colonialist literature, and others see it as the beginning of post-colonialist. In either event, it is dealing with the problem of colonialism. So now it's not just an intellectual problem, like say the Enlightenment is, and it's not only applied to European societies, it's now being applied globally, and some of the challenges that arise out of that, which I think we still live with. So racism is certainly one of the main themes in the text. The narrator, let me say a little bit about this. His name is Marlowe. He is there regularly in Conrad's novels. We meet Marlowe as a regular sort of figure. I think it's a mistake to see Marlowe as a representative of Conrad, well, although some people do see him that way. But he is the main character through whose eyes we read everything. And yet I think we're given reason in the text to question whether the narrator is entirely reliable, morally. Maybe not in terms of the details, although I think even there's an ambiguity that creeps in. So when I talked about narrative perspective in an earlier class, here we get the sense that the narrator is unreliable. It's not just that he's not omniscient, it's that he ought not to be trusted. There are things about his narration which makes us think that we ought to be suspicious of that. So this is really interesting. So in addition to criticizing colonialism, he is also leading us to question the trustworthiness of rational Western enlightened people. So in that sense, it's also the beginning of a postmodern text during the modern period, because it's questioning reasoning and the very possibility of neutrality. There is no such thing, say the postmodernists. We're always caught up in our subjectivity, and we do things out of self-interest, not out of objective, detached, neutral, scientific stances. Yes?
But do you think he's having the perspective that there's no source that can be trusted, or just simply that Marlowe's maybe European perspective is the wrong one and that there would be a better perspective?
He doesn't really get into that. It's a good question. I mean, it doesn't go so far as our postmodern views, which there is no such thing as authority, which they say authoritatively. The irony never ceases to amaze me. But no, so you're right. So he's not going so far as to the contemporary perspectives, which is to question all authority. It is a critique of the reliability and the objectivity and the neutrality and the goodness of the Western European. I didn't break that. Let's try it again. That's interesting. That wasn't sorry. Yeah. Yeah, it is. That's kind of cool. Should be interesting. Crash, burn. That was interesting. You gonna be all right?
Oh, yeah.
So it is certainly introducing some questioning, but it's not so profound as to question whether reasoning is even possible. You're right. It's not even interested in that. What it is questioning is the objectivity and the neutrality and the benevolence of the colonialist powers. In fact, it will present them as being rapacious and totally self-motivated, and all they're interested in is ivory. So greed. Now the ivory is an interesting symbol itself, because they're after the ivory for the purposes that we utilize ivory. I mean, what do we use ivory for? I mean, he names some of them, but the main use is in pianos. You can use it for combs. I think there are a few other uses, but mainly it's for pianos. So it's a cultural symbol. Refined high culture. Learn to play the piano. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes money. And it takes, I mean, you have to actually have the piano, so you have to have a great deal of property in order. So the attempt to gather ivory from Africa is for the sake of advancing culture on the one hand, but it's doing so at the expense of the Africans. And there's no moral guidelines to the purchase. In fact, the other main character, Kurtz, which in German means short, which is interesting, is an amoral man. He seems to have placed himself outside the boundaries of civilization, and he acts accordingly. But actually the novella is called Heart of Darkness. So the question is, one of the great questions of Heart of Darkness is, what exactly is the heart of darkness? What is meant by the heart of darkness? And there are a few different possibilities there, I think the novella suggests. One of them is the reference to Africa itself as a dark place. It's described as very dark. And if you think about the Enlightenment as a reference to the light, and Africa as an unenlightened continent, then the center of Africa, so if Africa roughly looks, like a continent like that, in the Congo where this is in the center of that, then, and this is the dark continent, then the heart of the darkness is the center of the dark continent. So that is one possibility. That's the heart of darkness there. Although interestingly on the map, at this point, it's described as a white spot because nobody's managed to penetrate, because there's a big jungle in the Congo and nobody's managed to get in there. I mean, it's a difficult place to get to, and it's a dangerous place to get to furthermore. So nobody has yet, for all of the colonization of Africa, the Congo has not yet been colonized. So in that sense, nobody's gone there and charted it on a map, so now you can see what's there. So it has thus far evaded Western colonialism, but also Western rationalism. So that's one sense in which it's also dark. In that sense, the place that's white is also dark, which is a strange sort of thing. But there are other sense of darknesses in the novella, and I think that so it's one possibility. I think there are better explanations for it, though. And they're presented right at the outset of the story. So let's begin looking at this novella from the beginning, and I'll just draw your attention to this. So we're told, the Nelly, a cruising yawl, swung to her anchor without a flutter of the sails and was at rest. The flood had made, the wind was nearly calm, and being bound down the river, the only thing for it was to come to and wait for the turn of the tide. So I actually once rode on the Thames River at the head of the river race. The Thames River is one that when the tide comes in, it's moving really fast, and you row, and if it's going against you, you're going nowhere. It feels like you're going nowhere. Whereas when the tide's coming back out, if you're with it, you've got the benefit of the tide going out, and you're flying. And so for a cruising yawl that depends on the power of the sail to move it, there's no point in going against the tide. You just wait, and then when the tide goes, you go out with it. So that's what's being described. Now the flood that's being referred to here, and the water, I think, is a reference also not only to the water, but also civilization. So it's high tide, it's in here, and then it will go back out. So the water has pushed up the Thames to the point where it reaches its zenith, and then it starts to drop as the water then goes back out. And that it's a reference in that sense to Western civilization having reached its peak and now diminishing. As the imperial power has reached its limit, now the moral degeneration ensues, and it's on its way back down. I think that's implied. I'm reading a lot into this here, but I think that's what Conrad is suggesting here. So let me expand on that. he says, the sea reach of the Thames stretched before us like the beginning of an interminable waterway. In the offing, the sea and the sky were welded together without a joint. And in the luminous space, the tanned sails of the barges, drifting up with the tide, seemed to stand still in red clusters of canvas, sharply peaked with gleams of varnished spirits. A haze rested on the low shores that ran out to sea in vanishing flatness. The air was dark above Gravesend, and farther back still seemed condensed into a mournful gloom, brooding motionless over the biggest and the greatest town on earth, which is London. So by this point, London is, I think, beyond dispute, the greatest city in the world. When Charles Dickens writes The Tale of Two Cities, he's writing about London and Paris. Now Paris has been largely eclipsed by London. London is the great power in this day. And Conrad's writing this not in order to wave the British flag. He's talking about, again, the advance of civilization in Britain up to a point, and then what will follow that, which is the rise and the fall of nations. Just like the rise and the fall of the waters, the nations also rise and fall. Then we get the portrait of the company, the director of companies, rather, our captain and our host. We four affectionately watched his back as he stood in the bows looking to seaward. On the whole river there was nothing that looked half so nautical. He resembled a pilot, which to a seaman is trustworthiness personified. It was difficult to realize his work was not out there in the luminous estuary, but behind him, within the brooding gloom. Now note the portrait here. Britain is being presented as a dark place. And the sea and the on the horizon, that's the luminous place, that's the light place. So sailing is an enterprise of illumination, of growing knowledge, and so forth. So he describes various figures there in the boat, and we get a variety of them. We get the lawyer, the best of old fellows, heavily ironic, by the way. Lawyers are almost never well portrayed in literature. Shakespeare thought they all should be hanged. When he says the best of old fellows, I think it is meant ironically, had, because of his many years and many virtues, the only cushion on deck. In other words, for his lack of virtue, he took the only cushion, he was sitting on it, and was lying on the only rug. The accountant had brought out already a box of dominoes and was toying architecturally with the bones. Dominoes are made, I think, also of ivory. To the bones, right? Marlowe sat cross-legged right aft, leaning against the mizzenmast. He had sunken cheeks, a yellow complexion, a straight back, an ascetic aspect, and, with his arms dropped, with palms of hands outwards, resembled an idol. That's interesting as well. The director, satisfied the anchor had good hold, made his way aft and sat amongst us. We exchanged a few words lazily, and there's a little conversation and so forth that went forth. And then it goes on a paragraph down to talk about the London, and particularly the estuary of the Thames, as being a place where British greatness was manifested historically. So it talks about men of whom the nation is proud, from Sir Francis Drake, who served under Elizabeth, to Sir John Franklin, knights all, titled and untitled, the great knights errant of the sea. So sailors being compared to the knights of old. So the age of adventure and chivalry is connected with the boats and with the British Navy furthermore. So this is the new frontier. This is the new frontier for moral character to be demonstrated as well. And it says, that is the Thames, had borne all the ships whose names are like jewels flashing in the night of time. From the Golden Hind, returning with all her round flanks full of treasure under Drake, to be visited by the Queen's Highness, and thus pass out of the gigantic tale, to the Erebus and Terror. These are Franklin's ships that got lost in the Arctic, and were just discovered recently, actually, in Canada, the Erebus. they'd sailed out from here, and the sun set, and then 3 paragraphs on, Marlowe says, "And this also," said Marlowe suddenly, "has been one of the dark places of the earth." So there's the point here. This also has been one of the dark places of the earth, in reference to London. Now, why does he say that? And in what sense does he mean this? I'll skip over the words intervening here and let him explain. "I was thinking of very old times, when the Romans first came here, 1900 years ago, the other day. Light came out of this river," because again, at this point, Darwinian theories of evolution have become popular, and 1900 years, which would have once counted to be a long time, are now being said like a drop in the bucket. If the years are millions and millions of years of age, then 1900 years isn't that long ago. So he doesn't say that, I think that's what's in mind, just the other day. "Light came out of this river since." You say nights? Yes, but it is like a running blaze on a plain, like a flash of lightning in the clouds. We live in the flicker. May it last as long as the old earth keeps rolling. But darkness was here yesterday. Imagine the feelings of a commander of a fine, what do you call them, trireme in the Mediterranean, ordered suddenly to the north, run overland against the Gauls in a hurry, put in charge of one of these craft, the legionaries, a wonderful lot of handy men they must have been too, used to build, apparently by the 100 in a month or two, if we may believe what we read. Imagine him here, the very end of the world, a sea the color of lead, a sky the color of smoke, a kind of ship about as rigid as a concertina. So going up this river with stores or orders or what you like, sandbanks, marshes, forests, savages, precious little to eat, fit for a civilized man, nothing but Thames water to drink. No Falernian wine here, no going ashore. Here and there a military camp lost in a wilderness, like a needle in a bunch of hay. Cold, fog, tempests, disease, exile, and death. Death skulking in the air, in the water, in the bush. They must have been dying like flies here. Oh yes, he did it. Did it very well too, no doubt, and without thinking much about it either, except afterwards to brag of what he had gone through in his time, perhaps. They were men enough to face the darkness, and perhaps he was cheered by keeping his eye on a chance of promotion to the fleet at Ravenna, that's in Italy, by the by, if he had good friends at Rome and survived the awful climate. So he's imagining himself 1900 years before and the Romans coming to colonize Britain. They were also once colonized. And this must have been, at one point, one of the dark points of the earth. So he's speaking as a British man who's now colonized Africa and imagining it the other way around. And this would have been one of the dark places at that point, with far better warrant, actually, because it's cold and it's dark. And there were savages, without a doubt. Now, what's interesting about that is he is going to compare and contrast from this point, at least right here, how different this age is from the past age. And this is where it's interesting. Because the point of colonization is that it has happened historically. It's happened throughout all ages and under different kingdoms. But this age is different, and here's where he says it is. He says, mind, lifting one arm from the elbow, the palm of the hand outward, so that with his legs folded before him, he had the pose of a Buddha, preaching in European clothes and without a lotus flower. Mind, none of us would feel exactly like this. What saves us is efficiency. The devotion to efficiency, rationalism. But these chaps were not much account, really. They were no colonists. Their administration was merely a squeeze, and nothing more, I suspect. They were conquerors, and for that you want only brute force, nothing to boast of. when you have it, since your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. They grabbed what they could get for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale, and men going at it blind, as is very proper for those who tackle the darkness. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. Well, now he's reflecting on Africa. So he's thinking as a British sailor about what it would have been like back then, and then the reason he's reflecting on it is he is making the analogy between what happened then to what happens now. And he's partly excusing it. And the place where he doesn't excuse it is that he says what distinguishes it is our greater efficiency. So efficiency is the term that distinguishes the modern enlightened colonialism from the ancient unenlightened colonialism. Back then it was just a squeeze. They took what they could, they pillaged, raped, whatever, took it, but the purpose wasn't to go there to utterly dominate it and to remain and to conform everything to a European image. Whereas in the colonial period of this day, they brought with them administration and rationality. So India is a railroad is brought to India, and an administration and a political machinery and the rule of law. These things come with it. In Rome, the colonies would have had the rule of law and they would have left roads and so forth, but the purpose of those was simply to extract goods. That's what he's saying. I'm not sure if it's true. But that's what Marlowe is suggesting. Whereas now, it seems like there's a greater efficiency, in other words, a greater commitment to domination. That's what he means by efficiency. An efficiency, a limitless dominion. What he's exploring in this is the relation between European culture and power and evil. That's what this novella is about, it seems to me. So let me brief interlude here. When I was an undergrad in third year, I studied European history. One of my courses in European history, and we looked at Nazi Germany because my lecturer at the time, Robert Galately, was a Nazi Germany expert. That was his area of expertise. And I found the period really interesting, like almost everybody does, in fact. Yeah, interesting in a sort of surreal, horrifying way. And he had me read a book by a woman by the name of Hannah Arendt. And it was called Eichmann in Jerusalem. That was the title, but the subtitle was A Report on the Banality of Evil. It's an interesting text. Let me give you a little background to this. Hannah Arendt's a Jewish philosopher. She studied under Martin Heidegger. Heidegger is arguably the most important philosopher of the 20th century. German, operating in the 1930s during the time of the rise of Nazi Germany. One of his star pupils is Hannah Arendt, who's a Jew. She flees the country to avoid the gas chambers. Not that they happened at that point, but it was clear where they were going. So many Jewish intellectuals left Germany, and like she did, she went to the U.S. Eventually ended up at the University of Chicago and so forth. But after the war was over, she was writing for the New York Post, I believe, in 1961. So I think this is written in 1961. This man, Adolf Eichmann, have you ever heard of Adolf Eichmann? You might not have. he was a.
I'm saying I've heard of him.
Okay, so he was the man. He basically is a bureaucrat. So he doesn't have the names like he doesn't have Hitler or Goering or, the more famous figures. He's a lesser known figure, but he's not an insignificant figure because he was the bureaucrat responsible for the deportation of the Jews from Western Europe to the death camps. So he was a magnificent organizer. So that was his great skill, was organizing things, administrating things. Yes?
Was he the one that went into hiding and was
Yes, so I'm getting to that, and yes, you're right. So he was the one responsible for this deportation. Now, he was one of the ones that went missing at the end of the Second World. A lot of high-ranking officials went missing. Did they die? What happened to them? Nobody knew where Eichmann was. Eventually, the State of Israel rose up. The modern nation State of Israel arose in this time, and with them there were those who sought the Nazis wherever they were, wanted to bring them to justice. And they captured Eichmann in Argentina, Buenos Aires, I think. And they brought him to trial in Jerusalem, which now is part of the Israeli state, which hadn't existed when the crimes took place. Right? They brought him to trial there. And they prosecuted him for crimes against humanity. Crimes which had at that point that he committed them not existed under any legal code. Because anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself on this. She studied Eichmann's testimony and listened to him, and one of the things that he said, which she found astonishing, was that he was a committed Zionist. He had read enough history that he was firmly committed to the idea of a nation state for the people of Israel because they'd been persecuted throughout their history. And so he wanted to solve that problem for the Jewish people because he'd read enough of the horrors visited upon the Jewish people, and so he was a committed Zionist, and he talked about having read the materials and so forth. And when he started rounding up the Jews, and part of his role, he was really excited about the prospect of sending them to their own state. And the plan was to send them, there was various suggestions, but one of them was, if you played the game Risk, was to send them to Madagascar. That was actually on the cards. You know where Madagascar played Risk? It's this island, you never heard of it otherwise. But in 1942, I think, the Allies came up through Africa and into Italy, and that it was no longer possible. You can't send them down south anymore, no longer possible. And at that point, the plans changed. So now we've got them in camps, and what do we do with the Jewish problem? At that point, maybe this is the original intent on some people's part, but it was not on Eichmann's part. He was told to send them east to the death camps. And he agreed to do it because it was an order from Hitler, who is the Führer, and his word was law. And he also noticed that he was just a little man. He was a bureaucrat, but he wasn't one of the aristocrats. The aristocrats, Count von so-and-so and Harrison, the social elite, they complained they didn't say anything. They went along with it, and he thought, well, if people who are my social superiors will not say anything, and he didn't add, and if the church isn't really saying anything, then who am I, a little man such as I am, to stand in the way of this? And so he shrugged his shoulder and he said, an order is an order, I have to go and do this. So this is what she's talking about, the banality of evil. Because the sense is anyone who's going to send 6 million Jews to their deaths must be a monster, right? To kill people on a massive scale, must hate the Jews. And yet his testimony was that he did not. And he did it because it was an order. So this is what she's talking about, the modern notion of evil perpetuated or perpetrated by appallingly amoral people. Think that moral considerations don't apply to them. They just appeal to authority and to power. And modern bureaucracies act in this way. So the reason I say this is I think Conrad's describing something of the same thing. So the people aren't necessarily monsters. Although I think Kurtz is far more monstrous than Eichmann ever was. But he's somebody who recognizes that there are no moral boundaries. And because it's just a means to an end, it's about efficiency. And he was being efficient. He was a cog in the machine. He was just doing his duty. And it was not only legal in Germany, it was illegal to oppose it. So he did what he was told. And the human rights violations which he was accused of didn't exist because there was no world court as it came out after the Second World, and he was being tried for crimes that happened before it. This was part of his defense and so forth. So she was exploring all of these things. She was called a traitor by the Israelis, among other things, but about the problem of evil in the modern age, where it doesn't you can do it on the most extraordinary scales and yet not be yourself having any hostility towards the people you're committing it against. That was what she said. Yeah.
Do you know of the psychology experiment?
Yeah.
Stanley Milgram. I'm sticking that.
Where they're torturing people. I can't remember as well.
The Stanley Milgram experiment, where they press the buzzers increasingly
The
until
voltage and the detachment from it, as well as the obeying orders from it, because it's
Yeah.
sort of authority and whatnot.
But they based it around that.
That same sort of idea. Now, has that not been proved to be a fraud now?
The experiment?
Yeah.
They did it.
No, it had
No.
Like they can't do it again?
No, I know they can't do it again, but
Yeah, they can.
fraud. How would you mean?
I'm wondering that it actually took place. Am I not remembering that properly? I thought recently there was some dispute over whether that experiment actually happened the way it did. Never mind.
Well,
I don't know.
the experience was that they
keep
did
teaching
it,
it.
but the person was behind on the other side, so the person zapping couldn't see, but
Right.
the person on the other side was set up, so that person wasn't actually zapped.
Right.
They removed themselves from the machine and they put it in something else, and they just.
They acted like they're.
They just
Right.
screamed, nothing happened.
That's good. Can you do that again? Yeah. Good acting. So what it's really, so the reason I say that, the heart of darkness, is that the exploration of the limitless depravity of human nature that can even, with power, limitless power, and a devotion to efficiency, what atrocities can be committed without thinking that it's an atrocity. I think that that's what the novella is about. Desensitization, the belief that might makes right, the idea that power is neutral, the idea that rationality and the Enlightenment values are ones that are going to bless everyone, and the consequences, well, I think that's what the novella is really about. I don't think it's about Africa. Really, I don't think it's, even though I know the context is colonialism, and I know that there's the racism, I don't really think it's even about racism. I think it's about evil. And racism might be a form of the evil, but actually I think it's a bigger critique than mere racism. It's how depraved the human heart is, when it has no moral restraints placed on it. And that's what it has when it's in a position of absolute power. So in that sense, it's very much of a Tolkien-esque type critique of evil. But that's my take on it. It's not, I know there are a lot of others. Yes?
How can we relate the immoral idea, the idea of people who are immoral, that brings people to moral relativism in literature and history? Like, moral relativism to me almost sounds like the exact same thing as immoral.
No, moral relativism is just something, morality is a cultural construct, and, we might call subjecting women to, giving up women no civic rights and so forth, we may regard that as abhorrent and say that that's a terrible thing. But if in Saudi Arabia we want to put women in burqas and not allow them to drive or whatever, that's their context, their culture. Who are we to judge? Or I'll give you a better illustration. In India, there was a practice in which widows were burnt alive. So when the husband died, the widows were burnt.
Because the husband died, she's born.
She's burned as well because she was part of the husband's property, so it goes along with it. That was just the standard practice. And the British came in, and this is true, and I can't remember the exact, the name of the British government, I can look it up. But the British governor at the time came in and saw this practice and said that anyone who does this from now on is going to be hanged. And that's our cultural context. You're under British rule, and the next person who burns a widow is going to be hanged. And the Indians were outraged at the imposition of British morality on them. So then the question is, were the British right in doing this, and why? Because there was British morality, there was Indian morality. The Indians did this, the British opposed it. Was it just a power imposition? When that story has been given to university students in the past, here you get the problem of tolerance pushed right in your face. Were the British wrong to impose their values upon the Indians? Because the relativist or the tolerant will simply say, yes, they were wrong to do that in any context. In which case they're saying amorality is the norm. And I think then it's the symptom of the very thing that Marlowe is critiquing. But tolerance is the only thing taught in our public universities now. It's tolerance and inclusion, and that includes every practice. There's no way of speaking against it. So this novella, to my mind, is addressing some of the issues that still bedevil our postmodern world, if you want to call it that. Did you have a question or an observation?
I was gonna say, what if someone from a different country came to North America and said, well, what if someone from a different country came to our country, saw someone who was gay and said, well, if you guys have gay relationships, you're gonna get hanged. Does that make it right?
If they say that, or because that's their cultural context?
So that's their cultural context, and they're coming into our country saying otherwise.
Well, that's the question. And you could say, well then, but this is Canada, so we don't allow that. Well, okay, but that's intolerant then.
So you think we're becoming more of a tolerant society?
I think that the phrase tolerance is a moral antibiotic. It destroys everything in its path. And so the reference to tolerance doesn't really do much.
No, it's tolerating evil.
It's tolerating evil as well. It's drawing an equivalence between moral evil and moral good. Let me give you another illustration that just arose today. Barbara Streisand, the 60s singer, 70s actress, talked about Michael Jackson, who's been accused of pedophilia. That was his sexual inclination, and so.
I'm done.
Yeah, well, that's what I thought. But she is a very influential cultural figure in certain circles. But that was her comment on Michael Jackson. Well, that was, and the kids they were all right with it. Right, so there's complaints now, but so this isn't to get into political, politics here, but it is to talk about how the issue of morality becomes a really troublesome one in modernity. If it's just power, that might makes right. Then you get into you talk about cultural relativism. I don't think cultural relativism is the real issue. The real issue is a Nietzschean beyond good and evil. And then, this is Friedrich Nietzsche, it's just a will to power. And in fact, those who have power ought to will the subjection of other people, and they ought to act upon it, because there are no constraints on it, which became the Nazi ideology, furthermore. Yes?
So that kind of idea is also in the movie adaptation of this?
Yeah, I'm going to play clips from that as well, but you're right. So there's a movie by Francis Ford Coppola called Apocalypse Now, which if you haven't seen it, you should see it. I think it's in 1979. Some really famous actors in it. Marlon Brando and, what's his name? Martin Sheen. Charlie Sheen's father when he was younger. And it's set in the context of the Vietnam War. So they've taken it out of the African context and replaced Britain with America, and the names of the figures. So Kurtz is played by Brando, and Martin Sheen takes the role of Marlowe. That really interesting, and I think entirely suitable to take that sort of narrative and apply it in a different situation. Whether he's correct in his assessment of the Vietnam War, that doesn't matter. That's almost by the by, although for some it will be the case. But that's really good, so I'll play that clip at the end here. But I think that is really what is going on, because as we note that Marlowe travels into Africa and then up the Congo, one of the things that appalls him is the inefficiency of the stations that the company has. So it's just this inefficiency. It makes him, recoil in disgust. They're not very efficient. They don't do things properly. There's no order. It's chaotic. And they are prone to brutality, like public displays of brutality. Whereas in European civilization, they do that in hospitals or behind the screen, but they don't do it on the streets. Yeah, that's my little gloss on it. It's not his comment. We do it in the hospitals. So that he notes that the native, so the Congolese, not that they have this, there is no Congo, there will be tribes there, but the Congolese have been forced into the company's service, so a form of slavery. And they suffer from overwork and ill treatment. So his term to describe this is it's inefficient. Remember and go back to what we said from Jonathan Swift's The Modest Proposal. What recommended the eating of the babies was that it was a more efficient way of dealing with the Irish problem. It gives money to the parents. It puts food on the table, it promotes the economy, it takes care of the problem of too many little Irish babies, et cetera, et cetera. It's an appeal to efficiency. Used in terms of numbers, remember he quantifies everything. So it's this appeal and almost the love of efficiency, overall moral consideration. So at the same time as the critique of Western civilization without morality is going on, I think he's talking about, as much as anything, it's an exposure of modern science and its viewpoint. It's allegedly amoral viewpoint. But it begins with that, with the observation that this also has been one of the dark places of the earth. And now it's not. From there, he will then go on to Brussels, because the company he works for is based in Brussels, which is in Belgium. Now, the reason why that's relevant is the Congo is a Dutch colony.
So Belgium is also.
Yes. So the company is based in Belgium, and he just works for. He's in Britain, but the Belgians have probably just chartered a ship from Britain to do the service. So he's working for a Belgian company. He goes to the Brussels. The head of Brussels, or the center of Brussels, or a center of Belgium rather, which is in Brussels. And let me see if I can find the. Where is it? Okay, so here it is. There it is. So how many pages in? I don't have the exact page number, 1633. So it's about 6 pages in. And he goes there to Brussels, and here's the description. A narrow and deserted street in deep shadows, high houses, innumerable windows with Venetian blinds, a dead silence, grass sprouting between the stones, imposing carriage archways right and left, Immense double doors standing ponderously ajar. I slipped through one of these cracks, went up a swept and ungarnished staircase as arid as a desert, and opened the first door I came to. Two women, one fat and the other slim, sat on straw-bottomed chairs, knitting black wool. The slim one got up and walked straight at me, still knitting with downcast eyes, and only just as I began to think of getting out of her way, as you would for a somnambulist, a sleepwalker, stood still and looked up. Her dress was as plain as an umbrella cover, and she turned round without a word and preceded me into a waiting room. I gave my name and looked about. Deal table in the middle, plain chairs all around the walls. On one end, a large, shining map, marked with all the colors of a rainbow. There was a vast amount of red, that's the British color. Good to see at any time, because one knows that some real work is done in there. A deuce of a lot of blue, that's the French. A little green, that's the German. Smears of orange, that's the Dutch. And on the east coast, a purple patch, that's the Italians. To show where the jolly pioneers of progress drink the jolly lager beer. However, I wasn't going into any of these. I was going into the yellow, that's the Belgians. Dead in the center, and the river was there, fascinating, deadly, like a snake. Ah! So there's a snake, so the river, so that if this is Africa and the Congo is here, the Congo River is penetrated by a river that's like a snake. And the snake has obviously the ominous tones of Satan. A door opened, a white-haired secretarial head, but wearing a compassionate expression, appeared, and a skinny forefinger beckoned me into the sanctuary. Its light was dim, and a heavy writing desk squatted in the middle. From behind that structure came out an impression of pale plumpness in a frock coat. The great man himself. He was 5'6", I should judge. Hardly a great man. And had his grip on the handle end of ever so many millions. He shook hands. I fancy murmured vaguely and was satisfied with my French. Bon voyage. In about 45 seconds, I found myself again in the waiting room with the compassionate secretary who, full of desolation and sympathy, made me sign some document. I believe I undertook, amongst other things, not to disclose any trade secrets. Well, I'm not going to. I began to feel rather uneasy. You know, I am not used to such ceremonies, and there was something ominous in the atmosphere. It was just as though I had been let into some conspiracy. I don't know, something not quite right. And I was glad to get out. In the outer room, the two women knitted black wool feverishly. People were arriving, and the younger one was walking back and forth introducing them. The old one sat on her chair. Her flat cloth slippers were propped out on a foot warmer, and a cat reposed on her lap. What are they knitting? A few lines down. Often far away there, I thought of these two, guarding the door of darkness, knitting black wool as for a warm pall. One introducing continuously to the unknown, the other scrutinizing the cheery and foolish faces with unconcerned old eyes. Ave, old knitter of black wool, morituri te salutant, those who are about to die salute you. It's what the gladiators would have said before they fought in the gladiatorial games. So in other words, the people coming into the room and going south to do the company's bidding are going to die. And the black knitting is for the pall cover for their coffin. And this is in the midst of Brussels, which is compared to a whitewashed sepulcher, by the way, elsewhere. So there are all sorts, I mean, if you were in any doubt about Conrad's depiction of the evil of the place, I think those suggestions should alleviate any doubts. This is being charged with the greatest hypocrisy, because remember, Jesus calls the Pharisees whitewashed sepulchres. Brussels is called a whitewashed sepulcher, and what is being done in there by these two ladies is likened to initiating people into death. And then when they go on, they go to a doctor. Next page, visit to the doctor. A simple formality, assured me the secretary, with an air of taking an immense part in all my sorrows. Accordingly, a young chap wearing his hat over the left eyebrow, some clerk, I suppose. There must have been clerks in the business, though the house was still as a house in a city of the dead, came from somewhere upstairs and led me forth. He was shabby and careless, with ink stains on the sleeves of his jacket, and his cravat was large and billowy, so his neck's kerchief, under a chin shaped like the toe of an old boot. It was a little too early for the doctor, so I proposed a drink, and thereupon he developed a vein of joviality. As we sat over our vermouths, he glorified the company's business, and by I expressed casually my surprise at him not going out there. He became very cool and collected all at once. I am not such a fool as I look, quoth Plato to his disciples, he said sententiously, emptied his glass with great resolution, and we rose. So then he goes in, and what does he do? He produces a thing like calipers, got the dimensions back, and front and every way taking notes. So his skull's getting measured. Why is his skull getting measured? Have you ever had your skull measured when you go to the doctors? I hope not.
Intelligence?
Hmm?
Is it for intelligence?
It would be in that day. So one of the things, but that's not the purpose here. But one of the things that would, so there was a so-called science related to your
The size of your cranium.
not just the size, but the dimensions and so forth. So there are certain features associated with genius. So there's a portrait of William Wordsworth where he's sitting there like this, and he's pointing there, and this is the place where genius rides. So he's pointing to the fact that he's a genius by the portrait. It's interesting. But no, it's because if he comes back in a box, they won't be able to identify him other than by the dimensions of his skull. If you've ever gone to a doctor, they don't measure your skull. There's no medical reason to do that. So he said, he was an unshaven little man in a threadbare coat like a gabardine with his feet in slippers. Note that everybody has feet in slippers. Comfortable. And I thought him a harmless fool. I always ask leave, in the interests of science, to measure the crania of those going out there, he said. And when they come back too, I asked. Oh, I never see them, he remarked. And moreover, the changes take place inside, you know. He smiled as if at some quiet joke. You are going out there. Famous. Interesting too. He gave me a searching glance and made another note. Ever any madness in your family? He asked in a matter-of-fact tone. I felt very annoyed. Is that the question in the interests of science, too? It would be, he said, without taking any notice of my irritation, interesting for science to watch the mental changes of individuals on the spot. But are you an alienist? I interrupted. Every doctor should be. A little, answered that original imperturbably. I have a little theory which you messieurs who go out there must help me to prove. This is my share in the advantages my country shall reap from the possession of such a magnificent dependency. The mere wealth I leave to others. Pardon my questions, but you are the first Englishman coming under my observation. I hastened to assure him I was not in the least typical. If I were, said I wouldn't be talking with you like this with you. What you say is rather profound and probably erroneous, he said with a laugh, and avoid irritation more than exposure to the sun. Adieu. How do you English say, eh? Goodbye. Ah, goodbye. Adieu. In the tropics one must, before everything, keep calm. He lifted a warning forefinger. Du calme, adieu. Okay. Why is he asking about his madness? Because one of the things that gets demonstrated in the heart of darkness is when people leave the trappings of civilization, they lose their moral compass. And all they have left is their power. Without anybody to watch them, they do what they've been charged to do. And the really good ones, like Kurtz, do so with ruthless efficiency. A commitment to efficiency that we find that Marlowe himself admires. admires. Not just notes, he admires it. And the madness to which he refers is one of the things that Kurtz is being accused of. He's gone mad. Now, the charge of madness, is it because they are worried about his mental health? They have no concerns about mental health, by the way. That's not their concern. It's because he's embarrassing the company. So it's the public relations fallout, the consequences. It's bad for business that he is going so far in his efficiency. He should be a little bit more circumspect. That's the real issue. So even in the, and they're sending Marlowe there to meet Kurtz and basically to take care of Kurtz. Shoot him.
Oh, I was not thinking that.
He's being sent there to solve the problem.
Oh. Let me take care of it.
Or at least that's what they think. Or replace him, or do something, take care of the problem by whatever means you need to. But note, at every turn, at every stage, there is no moral principle involved. They're all doing it for the sake of extracting ivory. That's what the company's all about. And Kurtz is the leading light in the extraction of ivory from the Congo, for which he is greatly admired by one and all, until he goes a little too far. The objection is not that he is immoral, it's that he is creating inefficiency. So in other words, from the context of the civilized Europeans, they have no categories left to condemn what he's doing. But I think that Conrad, who is depicting this, expects us to think this is atrocious, just like Swift, when he does so in A Modest Proposal, wants us to think this is appalling, this should stop. Note that he doesn't condemn it, but that doesn't mean we're not supposed to. So that's my reading on Conrad. I think Conrad is expecting his readers to think that this is an appalling state of affairs and want to stop it. But it's as I say, I think it's more profound than simply a critique of colonialism. That's a little bit, I think that's one level on which you could see it. I think it's more profound than that. But let me stop here, and I'm going to play a little clip from, if I can, Apocalypse Now, and we'll see how much time we have left to, if you can turn the light off, at least we'll be able to see it. Oh. I'll just take a second here, let me erase this. But at this point on the course, we've already seen that the discussion of the nature of good and evil has been there from the very beginning of the course. So when we looked at the Iliad, or we didn't look at the Iliad, we looked at the Odyssey and the Aeneid, the nature of the gods, the nature of the underworld, the moral framework was always there, and there was a sense of good and evil, and there was a punishment for evil, and there was a reward for being good. In the modern era, we see that these categories are starting to blur for the sake of the power that can be got if we do blur them. And colonialism of the sort that's expressed in Heart of Darkness is only one illustration of it, but I think it's just a particularly well done one. But let me come to this, and hopefully we can hear it. Maybe we won't.
I wanted a mission for my sins. They gave me one. Nobody'd ever gone on a mission like it before. And when it was over, I'd never want another one.
Your mission is to proceed up the Nung River in a Navy patrol boat. Pick up Colonel Kurtz's path at New Mung Ba. when you find the colonel, infiltrate his team by whatever means available, and terminate the colonel's command.
Terminate. Terminate with extreme prejudice.
My orders say I'm not supposed to know where I'm taking this boat, so I don't. But one look at you and I know it's gonna be hot.
Now we'll pick your boat up and put it down like a baby right where you want it. This is the first of the night. Air cam, son. We'll come in going under the rising sun. And about a mile out, we'll put on the music. It scares the hell out of the Stokes. My boys love it. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory.
Man, this is better than Disneyland.
I'm short and we gotta go up there so you can kill one of our own guys.
They're all dead, stupid.
There's a commanding officer here.
Ain't you?
He was close. He was real close. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him.
These are all his children, man, as far as you can see. They think he come to take him away, and I hope that is true.
Could we talk to Colonel Kurtz?
You don't talk to the colonel. Well, you listen to him.
Are you an assassin? I'm a soldier. You're an errand boy. Sent by grocery clerks. To collect the bill.
Anyway, you get the gist of it. The lines in the movie, a lot of them are taken right out of the book. So that one that you're not just said I'm a soldier. That's you're not a soldier. You're an errand boy. It goes to come to collect a bill. So he's a functionary. He's doing business. Now he also dies in the dark, and when he expires in the dark, this is what I want you to pay attention to when you go read it now, if you haven't started already, is when he dies, his last words are the horror. The horror. What is he horrified by? What does he see? I mean, what leads him to this comment? Because then at the end, after that, the natives who revere him and worship him, and these are all his children, revere him as a god because he's acted like a god. He's been dispensing evil or dispensing death at a whim, and has the power of the machines and the guns and so forth. That one of the natives comes in and leaves and said, "Mr. Kurt's dead," with a disgust. Why is he disgusted? And so those things are really interesting, those interactions, because the Africans regard the Europeans as a godlike power, and they utilize that to their own advantage. At the same time, the Africans, once they realize that these are mortal men, see them rather differently. But the technology allows them to escape that sense of men dealing with other men. Anyway, we'll come back to that next class, and I'll talk more about all of that. And